Hello, I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about how to plan a video presentation. And by video presentation, in this case, I do mean a pre-recorded video presentation, but the same basic principles will apply if you are doing a live presentation and trying to time out your remarks. Now, you always have the option of writing out everything, memorizing or practicing with that, or not, and improvising as you go. And we'll talk a little bit about how to strategize for both things as we go along. But we're going to start by looking at video presentations through the lens of a specific assignment that asks people to create a video on culture, and then talk about how to operationalize to take the instructions for the assignment and to turn that into a discrete set of things that lets you plan the presentation. So let's go ahead and look at this assignment. So this is coming from the Global Leadership course, where you have to create a video on culture. And we can take a look at the instructions and the big picture, everything on one screen. But I find that a helpful thing to do with an assignment like this is to reformat the information so that we can understand it as introductory information, a list of specific tasks, and any special instructions. So we'll take this information that we have and let's split that up. So our preamble here is the note saying, you will choose a culture to represent that is not your own. All right. So a culture that is not something that you belong to, however you choose to interpret that belonging. It could be one that you've moved to, one that you've experienced, one that you know from afar. But that's the thinking that we do before you move into the, okay, and here are the things that you submit. Because we have this list here. And while back here it's one large paragraph, once we start reformatting that second sentence, we see it's actually a list of 6 specific items. And that's really helpful when you are planning out a presentation to see, all right, here are specific things that I need to do, because then you start looking at it and can visualize how much time to spend on each. And if we're just looking at this at a glance here, okay, detailing what the culture is, all right, that's probably going to take at least a minute. What makes it unique, assumptions, truths, interesting facts. And then that last one, how the culture is similar and different from Western culture. Oh, if we're giving compare and contrast, that's probably going to take a larger portion of time than the other things. And so that's good to plan on in advance so you don't have a 5-minute, here's what the culture is, 1 minute each on what makes it unique, assumptions, truths, interesting facts, and then you're basically out of time with the last part. That last part looks like it is the most expansive, so you probably want to plan the most for that and to limit your remarks in the other sections just to make sure you have time for that. And then we see that there's an option to go uh, in a other than talking head direction, to incorporate a performance element, whether that's a solo one or with other people. Uh, but the most of this, 80% of the time, so for a 10-minute presentation, uh, 8 minutes at least should have you in there. Now, we have a list of different countries. You're not limited to countries. There are cultures within countries. There are cultures within our country, the United States. There are cultures within many of these other ones. Just to give you an example, in the country of Madagascar, where I lived for a year, there are dozens of ethnic groups. And even if you're trying to divide them linguistically, you're still going to end up with 16 or so major ethno-linguistic groups and lots of regional things within there. You could go from one village to another, and they can have very different thoughts about foods, actions, gesture, what it means to practice hospitality, and what it means to show respect. They can have very different traditions for that. And so you want to be specific about what you're identifying. If, say, you're describing something that's really specific to the Oaxacan people of Mexico, make sure you tell us, oh, the Oaxaca Valley region in Mexico, or this Joaquin Mexican American community that has become its own thing. Be specific about that. But will be many things that you can talk about, and being specific about what country or culture will help you narrow things down. And I suggest being more specific than not, because if we're talking about Spain, Catalan culture has some notable difference from some other areas. All right, and if we look at the rubric here, we'll see that there is a bit of a range here in the time that we would spend on this. So it's not strict must be 10 minutes, 600 seconds, but fit within 1 minute of the allotted time. So that means we have 9 to 11 minutes there, which is good to know. I would still suggest planning on 10 minutes, because then if you speak a little fast, you'll still come in over 9 minutes. And if you take a little bit more time than you think, then it gives you a 10% buffer. So now I do want to call your attention to part of the rubric. So we have a sixth of the grade, that's 2.5 of the 15 points, going to this nonverbal communication. These are the cues that you are giving in the video about how well you know your material, that will help people pay attention to what you're saying and not be distracted by other things that you're doing. And so if we look at this list, we see comfortable, confident, maintains good eye contact and posture. So this is something where a lot of people will have better posture standing than sitting, perhaps because of the chair that they have, but it makes it a lot easier for them to do that if they're standing. Keeping in mind where the camera is, which is often elsewhere from where your video is on the screen, but if you place the video dead center at the top, that is usually close to your camera. So if you're looking at the video of yourself, people will feel that you are making eye contact. Engaging presence, there are many different ways to do this, but one of these is to dress in a way that suits your presentation. If you're trying to call attention to how this culture is bright and colorful and gaudy, you could dress appropriate to that. If you'd rather people focus on your face and the expressions you're making, well, then dress that calls attention to your face or doesn't call attention to itself may be more appropriate. For those who've seen me on video, you know that I tend to wear all black, and that's partly a professional thing because I work in the theater and I work in the church, and also because it's just something that tends to not call attention to itself and focus on what I am doing or what I am saying. And that is a personal affectation, but also a professional one. Now, I'm certainly not saying you have to wear all black, but if you're wearing a bright t-shirt with a, let's say, a brightly colored graphic or text on it that calls attention to it so that people are thinking about that instead of your presentation, that may not be ideal. Now, if it's a t-shirt that you feel captures aspects of that culture that you're talking about, maybe that is what you want. But in that case, you would make sure to reference and point it out as that, so that it is part of that engaging presence. And part of that engaging is if you switch up what you were doing. You could talk for 10 minutes on one topic. It's harder to keep the audience engaged versus if you switch up what you're doing or how you're doing it. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later. Gestures, there are a lot of people who talk with their hands for various reasons, some of them cultural, some of them habitual. And if that is something that you do and you feel it gives emphasis and explains what you are doing, then I would make sure that your hands are visible when you are making those gestures, and that the camera is not so tight in on your face that that extra part of the communication is missed. I had a coworker, he and his wife were both Sicilian American. They talked with their hands a lot. And I don't mean that badly. That was part of their vocabulary of expression. And they could be saying things that were uh, seemed very calm and reasoned, but the hands would give you an idea of how urgent and things were. And I remember one interaction where one of the members of the couple was saying, you might get that from the car, but they were gesturing very, very strongly with their hands. And so you could tell this was something that they felt was very important. And that was part of that nonverbal communication that if the camera had just been on their face, we wouldn't have seen that gesture. Now that utilize space effectively, that's kind of a question of what else are we seeing on your camera? So if it is something where like you have a map behind you and you are referring to the map, great, you're using that camera field for something else. If you are presenting a one country and your map is of an entirely different part of the world, that might not be as good a use of space. So think about what the camera catches and where you might reposition your camera to get more of the things that you are interested in. All right, now the last one, the verbal communication, we have speaker shines with a confident, steady voice, excellent volume, and proper inflection and pronunciation. So let's talk about the volume first. So this is one where you, of course, want to be uh, speaking at an appropriate volume for your microphone. And something that people often miss is that they can adjust their microphone. If you're using Zoom, for example, there is a settings thing where you can change the gain or the sensitivity of your computer's microphone, and it'll show you little bars to show how much the capacity you're reaching. But also knowing where your microphone is and how loud the room is something where if you're recording in a very small room, you might speak softer just because you hear more of your voice back. So keep that in mind as you are choosing where you are recording, both for the background, for that space that you're going to be filling in the previous item, but also for how that affects your volume. Okay, confident, steady voice. If you know what you are going to be saying or know the core elements of what you're going to be saying in advance, that really does help a lot. In inflection and pronunciation, if it's a word that you're not sure about, look it up. And if you have a thing where you're not sure what the inflection is, you can always write notes where you underline, say, the syllables that are going to be accented. So just to illustrate that, the incorrect pronunciation of this would have inflection as opposed to this other incorrect inflection. So if that was a word where you're saying, I want to make sure that I pronounce that syllable with the due emphasis, and just underline it in your notes, inflection. And then you have that little visual reminder when you get to it. And so you can add that without having to think about it a lot, which is good for staying focused, for having that confident, steady voice, maintaining the volume, and all the other things that you want to be doing. All right, so let's talk about how to operationalize this to go from the instructions to outlining, timing, and drafting. Well, here's some things that might be helpful to know. First, if you are writing out all of your remarks, a double-spaced page with 1-inch margins, 12-point Times New Roman font, essentially all the things that you should be doing in APA style, including using our template, and it's going to be about 250 words. And it takes the average reader about 2 minutes to read 250 words aloud. Now remember, we are wanting to be engaging. We want some element of dynamicism, so you don't want to just read a standard essay out loud there. There's probably going to be some bits that are a little bit more conversational, and some where you are using your timing for emphasis in a way that will take a little bit more time than just reading 250 words for, say, a conference paper or a spoken presentation. So you do want to give yourself a little buffer there. And that for general timing, if you were to be using slides with bullet points, which are not the focus of this, but bear with me, if you're going to be using slides with bullet points, it's going to take about a minute to do approximately 4 concise bullet points on the slides for the audience to hear your remarks and to process it. And when you're doing your introduction and a recap at the end of your presentation, most people can improvise something because they've been doing it for much of their life. So you can write it out or improvise it, but improvising half a minute or a full minute for the introduction or the recap is probably something that you have practiced before and that you can do, on the fly. If you prefer to write it out, of course, write it out. But for budgeting purposes, we know that we're supposed to take approximately 10 minutes, and it's specified that's 9 to 11 minutes for full credit. So if you budget 90 seconds for introductory and closing remarks, then that gives you about 8.5 minutes of stuff to fill. And so that's going to be somewhere approximately 36 bulleted points, 9 content slides. That's not an exact number, so like don't do 36 and say, Dr. Considine, I went over. It's giving you a ballpark for information and that would fit within that time range. And keep in mind that some of these are going to be clustered because you're doing comparison and contrast. All right, here's the Easter egg time. When you are presenting, you want to make sure that people are focusing on what you're doing and not on unintended distractions. This might be, say, a cat that's walking in the background. It might be you have a poster on the wall that's unrelated and has people thinking about it versus what you're trying to tell them or teach them. And here, call your attention to if you are reading and you see, oh, there's a typo there. That is something that some people will find very distracting. And so rather than have that busy, and this can include things where you misspeak because you didn't give yourself enough information. So if you come across something when you are doing your practice round, make a note about it, like correct it, write things out, whatever you need. For emphasis, this include underlining the syllable that's getting emphasized or writing out a word phonetically that you have trouble pronouncing. Whatever it is, make a note so that when you're doing the recording that you submit, that it doesn't trip you up next time around. Now, some other things that are helpful to do when you are giving your introduction, give the viewer a verbal roadmap of the major points or content areas that you're going to discuss. And as you reach it, identify or introduce each of the major points or content areas. So if I was introducing Madagascar, might have a remark like, oh, there are many ways in which the culture of Madagascar's Sakalava ethnic groups have practices that Americans likely would find strange and vice versa. And if you're curious, Sakalava is a family of ethnic groups with a historical and regional connection. So it's not just one, it's a family of ethno-linguistically and historically related groups. And because this is a text that I think I'm going to be saying the same all the time, each way I practice it, I went ahead and wrote a note on how long it took me to say that for timing purposes. And whether you're improvising or doing a whole set of written out remarks, it is helpful to give yourself a map to go with that. And here's just some examples of talking points that you might put in. But as you write out your outline, you can create a parallel timeline. One way to do this in Microsoft Word is to have a 2-column table. And so you'll put a talking point in the left-hand column and then the timing in the right. And how do you know what the timing is? Well, you can allocate some time to start, but if you use a stopwatch function on your phone, you can time it as you practice your remarks and see, oh, hold on, I only took 30 seconds there. I can give more detail. Or awesome, I took 30 seconds there. I took 90 seconds on that other place where I wanted to spend a minute. It balances out. And so when you are giving notes to yourself, you can respond to what you saw yourself doing earlier and give a note like, spend extra time here. And do remember that there's a bit of natural adrenaline that changes our sense of time. So if you're speaking a little slower than you think you need to, it usually works out. And if you're trying to time these different sections, a stopwatch these days or a stopwatch app on an Android or iPhone will have a lap function. So you just press the lap button, and then at the end, you will have a breakdown of each quote unquote lap. And if you just do a new lap for every bullet point as you go through your outline, then you'll have a detailed set of timings to look at and see, okay, how did I do? As well as what did this all add up to in the end? And so then you can go revise that after you've practiced. All right, that's bringing our presentation to a close, so let me go through a couple resources. The Online Writing Center website does have a lot of resources on APA that may come up if you are bringing in other sources that you want to reference in a slide at the end. Now, a reference slide at the end is not going to take much time to present. You put it up and say, here are my references, and that's fine. But if you are crediting specific resources, it's good to have that. We have the APA manual does go into a lot of detail about citing videos and sounds and recordings and other things like that. But the most common ones are covered on the APA style website. That's that third resource here. And so if you have any questions about how to cite a resource that you're doing, especially if there's a artifact that you're referencing, like, oh, here's this song, and then you sing it on camera, and you're like, and the full thing is at this link. To know how to cite and reference that in APA style, absolutely, you can send us a question about that by writing to onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. You can also schedule an appointment for feedback at my.acu.edu and visit the Online Writing Center website for more information.